The forward operating base sat quiet under a sky that had forgotten what mercy looked like. Dust settled on everything: the tents, the equipment, the faces of men who'd stopped counting days. In the operations tent, someone's phone buzzed. Lieutenant Marcus Webb glanced down at the screen, read three words that made his stomach drop, and looked back up at the horizon like it might offer answers. "Don't wait for me." His spotter, Corporal Davidovich, noticed the change in his face but said nothing. They'd been pinned in this valley for 19 hours, ammunition running critical, medevac requests denied 3 times due to weather. The insurgent positions in the ridgeline had them boxed, and everyone knew it. Webb texted back with shaking thumbs, a message he'd never know didn't send. The cell tower had been down for 40 minutes. Above them, something that sounded like distant thunder rolled across the mountains, except the sky held no storms. The call came through on a frequency most of them had forgotten existed. A woman's voice, calm as Sunday morning, asking for target coordinates in a drawl that belonged nowhere near a combat zone. "Dagger 7, this is Ember 3-1. I'm your close air support. Send your 9 line when ready." The radio operator, a kid from Detroit who'd never heard a female pilot on a CAS mission, hesitated before responding. Someone in the back of the tent actually laughed, and said something about diversity. Hearing that died in his throat when the air split open. The A-10 Thunderbolt came in so low they could see the panel lines, the titanium bathtub that kept the pilot alive, the 7-barrel GAU-8 cannon that made the aircraft exist. But something was wrong. Hydraulic fluid streamed from the left wing root, a silver ribbon against blue sky, and the landing gear hung at an angle that made experienced men wince. "Ember 3-1, you're streaming fluid. Recommend RTB immediately." The radio operator's voice cracked on the last word. The response came back without hesitation, almost bored. "Copy that, Dagger 7. I'll head home after we finish the barbecue. Mark your friendlies and get your heads down." Webb watched through binoculars as the aircraft rolled into an attack run that should have been impossible with damaged hydraulics. The nose pitched down, the engine screamed, and 30-millimeter rounds began rewriting the ridgeline in dust and fire. Each burst sounded like fabric tearing, magnified 1,000 times. The insurgent positions that had held them for almost a day simply ceased to exist. On the second pass, the A-10's gear folded halfway up and stopped, frozen in mechanical agony. The pilot never acknowledged it, never changed her tone, just kept making runs until the ridgeline looked like the moon and Webb's phone buzzed again with a message that would take 3 hours to deliver. They didn't learn her name until later. They didn't know about the incident 2 years prior that had cost her a squadron, or the call sign that had become equal parts joke and judgment. They didn't know she'd requested this deployment specifically, volunteering for the sector everyone else avoided. All they knew was the sound of those engines, the precision of those runs, and the voice that stayed level when everything else was falling apart. "Dagger 7, Ember 3-1 is Winchester and heading home. Stay dangerous down there." The A-10 climbed away with its broken gear hanging like a broken promise, trailing fluid that caught the afternoon light. Webb watched it disappear and looked back at his phone. The message he'd sent still showed as undelivered. The one he'd received, "Don't wait for me," now felt like it had come from another lifetime. Around him, men who'd been writing final letters an hour ago were standing, checking ammunition, preparing to move. The ridgeline belonged to them now. Someone asked who that pilot was, and nobody had an answer. The tower recordings would show she flew for another 47 minutes after leaving their position, supporting 2 additional units while her aircraft bled hydraulic fluid and her gear hung useless. She never declared an emergency, never prioritized her own situation, just kept the drawl casual and the ordnance on target until there was nothing left to give. When she finally turned toward base, the sun was setting, and every gauge in the cockpit was reading red. The approach would have been challenging with full systems. With what she had left, it should have been impossible. But that was the thing about Captain Raina Ortiz. She'd spent 2 years being told what was impossible, and she'd stopped listening. Her call sign was Ember, given after an AC-130 gunship she'd been coordinating with went down in flames, taking her entire forward air control team with it. Some pilots would have requested a change. She wore it like armor, a reminder that fire doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it tempers. Sometimes it forges something harder than what came before. The control tower at Kandahar saw her on radar before they saw her visually, and when they did, 3 controllers stood up simultaneously. The A-10 was dragging its damaged gear, flying on fumes and determination, approaching with a precision that suggested either incredible skill or complete surrender to fate. Ember 3-1, Kandahar Tower. We have equipment standing by. Confirm your intentions. Her response carried that same maddening calm, like she was ordering coffee instead of attempting a landing that would end in flame or legend. Tower, Ember 3-1. I intend to put this bird on your runway and walk away from it. Beyond that, we'll see what happens. The gear wouldn't extend, wouldn't retract, just hung there in mechanical purgatory. Maintenance crews watching from the flight line knew that asymmetric drag was pulling the aircraft left, that every control input she made was fighting physics and winning by inches. The landing gear that had deployed would have to absorb impact it wasn't designed for. The gear that hadn't would scrape runway until something catastrophic happened. Standard procedure was to eject. Reina Ortiz had never been particularly interested in standard procedure. She brought the Warthog in on a glide path that seemed almost gentle, compensating for the asymmetric drag with aileron inputs so precise they seemed prescient. The deployed gear touched first, rubber screaming. Then the opposite side made contact in a shower of sparks that lit up the dusk like fireworks. The aircraft skidded, yawed, straightened, and rolled to a stop 3,000 feet down the runway with smoke pouring from the gear well and emergency vehicles converging like sharks on blood. Reina shut down the engines, completed her post-flight checklist with the same methodical attention she gave everything else, and climbed out into an evening that smelled like burnt rubber and aviation fuel. Her flight suit was dark with sweat. Her hands were steady. When the maintenance chief reached her, already cataloging the damage with eyes that had seen 3 deployments worth of broken aircraft, she just nodded toward the ordnance panel. She gave everything she had, Reina said quietly. Make sure she knows I'm grateful. The chief looked at the smoking wreckage of landing gear, the hydraulic fluid pooled under the wing, the titanium belly scorched from the skid, and decided this pilot was either crazy or something else entirely. Maybe both. Word traveled fast on a military base. By morning, everyone knew about the A-10 pilot who'd flown a crippled aircraft for nearly an hour, supporting ground troops while her systems failed one by one, then landed it like she was parking a car. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the core remained true. Lieutenant Webb heard it in the chow hall, recognized the call sign, and felt something settle in his chest. He found her 2 days later in the maintenance hangar, watching a crew replace the entire hydraulic system while she made notes in a worn logbook. She looked up when he approached, and he saw eyes that had stopped expecting anything easy a long time ago. You saved my platoon, Webb said, because there wasn't a more complicated way to say it. Reina studied him for a moment, then returned to her logbook. Your platoon saved themselves by holding position until support arrived. I just delivered the mail. He wanted to argue, to tell her about the messages that didn't send, about how close they'd been to overrun, about the sound of those engines cutting through despair. Instead, he asked about her call sign. The story came out in pieces, like she was reading from someone else's file. 2 years ago, Bagram Airfield, coordinating strikes for a Special Forces team pinned in a valley. The AC-130 gunship she was working with took an RPG through the fuselage, went down burning, and she'd stayed on frequency talking to them until the radio went dead. For crew, her entire forward air control team in the aircraft, all gone in the time it takes to breathe. The investigation cleared her whether bad intelligence, wrong place but cleared and forgiven were different countries on the same map. She requested reassignment to A-10s, the ugly, slow, survivable close air support bird that everyone else considered a career dead end. They gave me the call sign as a joke, she said, still not looking up from the logbook. Like I was the thing that survived the fire. I kept it because they were right. Webb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response to grief that had calcified into purpose. He thanked her again, and she nodded once, and he left understanding that some people don't want gratitude, they want the work. The squadron didn't know what to make of her. She flew more missions than anyone else, volunteered for the worst sectors, and maintained an emotional flatness that made her either the most dedicated pilot they'd seen or the most broken. Her efficiency reports were flawless. Her personal interactions were minimal. She ate alone, slept in short cycles, and spent her downtime in the cockpit of whichever A-10 was scheduled for maintenance, learning its particular damage and quirks. The other pilots called her Ghost behind her back, not because she was invisible, but because she seemed to be haunting her own life. The commander, Colonel Bridger, watched this pattern with concern that eventually became respect. He'd seen enough combat pilots to recognize the difference between someone running from trauma and someone running towards something they couldn't articulate. Reina Ortiz was hunting redemption in a landscape that kept moving the target. After the hydraulic failure landing, after the stories from Webb's platoon made their way through channels, something shifted. The jokes stopped. The call sign lost its edge. When she walked into briefings, people made room without thinking about it. The next mission came 3 weeks later, another valley, another platoon, another desperate call for close air support. This time, 2 insurgent technical vehicles with heavy machine guns had a medevac bird pinned down, casualties on board, nowhere to go. The Apache gunships were 30 minutes out. The medevac had maybe 10. Reina took the scramble before anyone else could respond, engines spooling before the briefing was finished, taxiing before the ordnance crew had cleared. The A-10 lifted into a sky that was too clear, too bright, the kind of weather that made everything visible, including your mistakes. Her wingman, a captain named Tors who'd been flying Warthogs since before the war had acronyms, fell in behind her with the easy confidence of someone who'd heard the stories but hadn't yet decided if they were true. They covered the distance in minutes, diving into the valley like stones with purpose. Below, the medevac helicopter sat on a patch of ground too small for hope, rotors still turning, unable to lift off without drawing fire that would shred it. The technical vehicles were positioned on ridges that gave them overlapping fields of fire. Smart tactics, bad luck for them. Reina's voice came through flat, professional, already analyzing angles. Ember 3-1 has visual, 2 technicals north and east ridge. Medevac, mark your position with smoke. The response was tight with stress, a pilot trying to keep it together while his crew chief returned fire with a personal rifle. Smoke out, Ember. We've got 3 urgent surgical on board and we're taking rounds. She didn't acknowledge the urgency. It was already factored into every decision. The A-10 rolled inverted at the top of her climb, a maneuver that gave her eyes on both targets simultaneously, then pulled through into a dive that committed her to the northern technical. Tors took the eastern position without needing to be told. The synchronization was instinctive, 2 pilots who'd never flown together operating like they'd done this 100 times. The GAU-8 opened up with that distinctive sound like the world's angriest zipper, and the northern technical came apart in pieces. Reina pulled off hard, felt the G-forces trying to gray out her vision, and was already setting up for a second pass before the debris stopped falling. Below, the medevac was turning, trying to use the brief respite to lift off. Tor's run went differently. His first burst walked rounds across the eastern ridge but missed the technical by meters, close enough to scatter the crew but not close enough to end the threat. He swore, set up for another pass, and that's when the technical's gunner got smart. Instead of targeting the medevac, he swung the heavy machine gun toward the circling A-10, firing a stream of tracer rounds that looked slow until you remembered each one was traveling faster than sound. Tors broke off, the rounds passing close enough to be respectful, and Reina was already moving. She came in from an angle that should have been impossible, the sun behind her, flying so low the A-10's shadow merged with the terrain. The technical's gunner never saw her until the 30mm rounds turned his position into scrap metal and bad memories. She pulled up, cleared the ridge by maybe 50 feet, and watched the medevac helicopter finally lift off, climbing fast, rotors clawing at thin air. "Medevac's clear, Ember 3-1. You're a goddamn artist." The pilot's voice carried relief so profound it was almost embarrassing. Raina didn't respond, just climbed back to altitude and ran through her post-strike checklist like she'd been filing paperwork instead of threading needles in a combat zone. They flew back in silence, Torres processing what he'd just seen, Raina already moving past it. The debrief was quick. Colonel Bridger listened to the recordings, watched the gun camera footage, and made a note that said nothing and meant everything. After Torres left, Bridger kept Raina back. "You flew under 50 feet in that last pass," he said, not quite a question. She met his eyes without flinching. The terrain allowed it. The situation required it. He studied her, this pilot who'd taken a call sign meant as punishment and made it prophecy, and decided some questions didn't need asking. "The medevac crew wants to thank you in person. I told them you're busy." She nodded once, grateful, and left. Bridger watched her go and thought about the difference between fearless and fear-integrated, about pilots who'd forgotten how to be afraid versus pilots who remembered every day but flew anyway. Raina Ortiz was the latter, and that made her more dangerous than any insurgent technical, more valuable than any advanced weapons system. She was someone who'd looked at the worst day of her life and decided it didn't get to be the last day. The medevac crew found her anyway. She was in the hangar again, sitting on the wing root of her A-10, reading maintenance reports like scripture. The crew chief who'd been returning fire with his rifle approached carefully like she might bolt. "Ma'am, I just wanted to," she cut him off with a raised hand, not unkind but absolute. "You did your job. I did mine. We all go home. That's the whole story." He stood there, 23 years old with a purple heart he hadn't earned yet, trying to figure out how to thank someone who didn't want gratitude. Finally, he just nodded and walked away. Later, he'd tell people about the A-10 pilot who flew like the aircraft was an extension of her spine, who talked about life and death like they were items on a checklist. But in that moment, he just felt the peculiar weight of being saved by someone who considered it unremarkable. Raina watched him go, then returned to the maintenance reports. The left engine was developing a vibration in the high-power range. She made a note. Details mattered. Details were the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. The missions continued. Each one slightly different, each one essentially the same. A pinned patrol here, a convoy ambush there, the endless chess game of asymmetric warfare where the rules changed but the stakes stayed constant. Raina flew them all with the same methodical precision, racking up combat hours that made her one of the most experienced CAS pilots in theater. Her efficiency reports glowed. Her personal relationships remained minimal. She existed in that narrow space between human and machine, effective precisely because she'd removed everything extraneous. The other pilots stopped trying to include her in social calls. They respected her too much to keep pushing. Torres became her unofficial wingman, the only pilot who seemed to understand that silence wasn't rejection, it was conservation of energy. They flew together, ate together sometimes, and never talked about anything that mattered. It was the most functional relationship she'd had in 2 years. He asked once about the AC-130, about the team she'd lost. She looked at him with eyes that had stopped being young and said, "We don't talk about the dead. We just try not to join them." The mission that changed everything came on a Tuesday, which felt wrong because Tuesdays were supposed to be unremarkable. A convoy of civilian contractors, engineers rebuilding a school, caught in an ambush 20 kilometers from friendly forces. The quick reaction force was already engaged with a separate incident. The nearest Apache was down for maintenance. Raina and Torres launched into a sunset that looked like a painting, all gold and purple, the kind of sky that made you believe in benevolent gods right up until reality reminded you otherwise. The radio traffic was chaos, multiple casualties, vehicles burning, someone screaming about RPGs. Reyna sorted through it with the dispassion of a surgeon, identifying the critical information and discarding the rest. Location, enemy positions, friendly status, everything else was noise. They reached the site as the sun touched the mountains, that golden hour when light becomes tactical liability. The convoy was scattered across the road, 3 vehicles burning, survivors using the wreckage as cover while insurgents in the surrounding hills poured fire down like rain. It was bad, the kind of bad that made experienced pilots hesitate. Reyna didn't hesitate. She rolled in on the western hill position, putting the sun directly behind her so the insurgents were firing blind, and walked 30-millimeter rounds across fighting positions that had been dug in and fortified. Torres took the northern position, his runs cleaner now, learning from her example. They worked the hills like sculptors, removing threats with precision that looked easy and was anything but. Each pass brought them closer to the terrain. Each run meant threading between friendly positions and enemy fire with margins measured in feet. The convoy survivors watched 2 A-10s carve the landscape into something survivable, watched them make pass after pass as the light failed, and the easy shots became impossible ones. Reyna flew through it all with her heartbeat steady, her hands sure, her mind in that place where training and instinct merged into something beyond conscious thought. She was the aircraft. The aircraft was her. Together, they were the thin line between massacre and survival, and that line held. When the hills were finally quiet, when the QRF rolled in to extract the survivors, the sun had set completely. She climbed into darkness that felt earned. The after-action report listed 14 enemy KIA, 0 friendly casualties beyond the initial ambush, and an unusual note from the convoy commander about the pilot who'd flown like she had a personal stake in their survival. Colonel Bridger read it twice, added it to a growing file, and made a decision. He found Reyna in the hangar, always the hangar, and said 3 words that stopped her mid-sentence. "You're going home." She looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, and maybe he had. Home was a concept that belonged to people with lives to return to, with families and futures and reasons to leave. She had a call sign and a mission and a debt that could never be paid. "Sir, he raised a hand, the same gesture she'd used on the medevac crew chief, authority recognized across species. "You've flown more combat hours than anyone in the squadron. Your rotation's up. Your orders came through this morning." She wanted to argue, to explain that staying was the only thing that made sense, but she'd been in the military long enough to know when a discussion was actually an order. She saluted, he returned it, and that was that. The squadron threw her a send-off that felt like a funeral for someone still breathing. They presented her with a plaque that listed her missions, her flight hours, her awards. Someone made a speech about dedication and valor that sounded hollow even as it was true. Torres shook her hand and said nothing, which was the most honest communication they'd ever had. The junior pilots who'd watched her operate with awe took photos they'd show grandchildren someday, explaining how they'd flown with the pilot who'd become a legend by refusing to be anything other than competent. Reyna endured it all with the same flat affect she brought to everything else, thanked them formally, and left for a C-17 that would carry her away from the only place she'd felt useful in 2 years. She took a window seat, watched Afghanistan shrink below her, and felt nothing. The absence of feeling was itself a feeling, a particular kind of emptiness that came from leaving unfinished business. The AC-130 crew was still dead. The debt was still unpaid, but orders were orders, and she'd learned a long time ago that fighting the system was less effective than working within it. Stateside felt like another planet. The air was different, thicker, heavier with moisture and meaning. People moved without urgency, spoke without checking sight lines, lived lives that had nothing to do with survival. Reyna processed through debriefs and medical checks and psychological evaluations with the same efficiency she brought to combat missions. The psychologist, a major who'd never deployed, asked how she was adjusting. "Fine, sir." He looked at her over glasses that made him seem older than he was, wise or weak depending on perspective. "Captain Ortiz, your combat record is exemplary, but your personal profile suggests isolation and possible unresolved trauma. I'd like to schedule follow-up sessions." She agreed because refusing would flag her file, attended 2 sessions that consisted of her saying fine in different ways, and then was cleared for reassignment. The psychologist made notes about high-functioning compartmentalization and recommended continued observation. Raina read the report, filed it mentally under bureaucratic theater, and moved on. She was assigned to an A-10 training squadron at Davis-Monthan, teaching new pilots to fly the Warthog. It was logical. It was appropriate. It felt like retirement before death. Teaching was harder than flying combat missions. Combat had clear objectives and immediate feedback. Teaching required patience she'd never cultivated, communication skills she deliberately atrophied. The new pilots looked at her with reverence that made her uncomfortable, asking questions about tactics and deployment as if war was a subject that could be studied rather than survived. She taught them the mechanics angle of attack, weapons employment, emergency procedures, and left out everything that mattered. How fear tastes like copper, how time compresses in a dive until each second contains hours, how you learn to sleep in 4-hour blocks and wake up reaching for a flight suit. They didn't need to know that yet. Some of them never would. The good ones understood what she wasn't saying. The great ones stopped asking. She identified 3 in her first class who had the right combination of skill and humility, and she pushed them harder than the others. They'd either break or become the pilots who brought people home. There was no middle ground in the Warthog. 6 months into the assignment, she got a letter. Physical paper, forwarded through official channels, written in careful handwriting that suggested English wasn't the writer's first language. Lieutenant Webb, thanking her again, updating her on his platoon, mentioning that his daughter was born and he'd named her Raina. The letter said he was out now, college on the GI Bill, building something that looked like a future. He said he thought about that day in the valley sometimes, about the sound of the engines and the voice on the radio that had stayed calm when calm was a superpower. He said he hoped she was okay, knew that was probably the wrong question but hoped it anyway. She read it twice, filed it in her desk, and never responded. What would she say? That she was teaching instead of flying, existing instead of living, going through motions that felt increasingly meaningless. That some debts couldn't be paid, only serviced, like interest on borrowed time. She went to the hangar instead, sat in the cockpit of a training A-10, and ran through startup procedures from memory until her hands stopped shaking. The second letter came from Tors, brief, professional, updating her that he'd made aircraft commander and was heading back to Afghanistan. He mentioned her techniques, how he taught them to his wingmen, how her influence carried forward through pilots who'd never meet her. He didn't ask how she was. He'd flown with her enough to know better. He ended with a call sign number and nothing else. She appreciated that more than any lengthy sentiment. He understood that names were just sounds, but call signs were identity. She'd been Ember when it mattered. Here, stateside, teaching simulator missions and grading check rides, she was Captain Ortiz, rank and service number, functionally interchangeable. The weight of that difference settled on her like sediment. She'd survived the fire that killed her team, survived missions that should have been fatal, survived the transition from combat to peace, and somehow this teaching, this safety felt like the thing that might finally break her. She requested reassignment to a combat squadron. The request was denied. Insufficient personnel to rotate. She submitted it again, denied again. She stopped submitting. 2 years passed in that peculiar way time moves when nothing changes. Classes cycled through, new faces asking the same questions, making the same mistakes, occasionally showing flashes of brilliance that reminded her why the mission mattered. She dated briefly, a fellow pilot who understood deployments and understood when she stopped returning calls. She went through the motions of normalcy: apartment, car, responsibilities, while feeling like an anthropologist studying a culture she'd never belonged to. Her efficiency reports remained excellent. Her personal life remained minimal. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who'd flown F-16s and transitioned to Warthogs for reasons he never explained, called her into his office one morning with an expression that suggested he'd solved a problem she didn't know she had. "Captain Ortiz, how would you feel about a different kind of deployment?" She kept her face neutral, military professional, but something in her chest shifted. "What kind, sir?" He smiled, and it wasn't entirely kind. "The kind where you teach pilots in theater, forward deployed training cadre, 6 months embedded with squadrons running combat operations." She said yes before he finished the sentence. The deployment orders came through in a week, faster than bureaucracy usually moved, which suggested someone somewhere had been planning this. She didn't care about the politics. She cared about the mission. 3 weeks later, she was back in Afghanistan, watching familiar mountains rise from familiar desert, feeling something that